Hey everyone, so in this video I want to talk about gyro stabilization within the SONY A7C. If you're not already aware, the SONY A7C actually stores gyro data within the metadata of its video files. And what this means is that you can run the video files through a software called catalystbrowse to basically stabilize the footage, and it works really well, but with some caveats. So I'm gonna get onto that a little bit later. But first of all, basically I did a little field test of some walking shots, some running shots, using both a gimbal and catalystbrowse to see if we could get a kind of floating camera effect, where the camera's basically floating through the air, almost like it's on a drone, basically. But you're actually just using your gimbal and you're stabilizing it in post. So it was just to see what kind of results we could get with that and if it could be practically used in a real life situation if you wanted to use it. And I did get some really insane results, so definitely stick around for them. So I did do a couple of kind of field tests here, and one was walking with the camera and the other running with the camera. And my girlfriend Gillian helped me out with this to kind of do a tracking shot, so you'll see that in the footage I'm about to show you. But basically I compared handheld without any stabilization, handheld with just IBIS turned on, the gimbal with IBIS turned on, and then the gimbal with no stabilization at all on the camera, but then with gyro stabilization in post. So that's the test we're doing here, and we'll go a bit more into depth of the specific gyro stabilized gimbal shots because they're the ones I'm really interested in to see if we can get that floating camera effect. So let's get into the footage just now. So let's start with the walking test first. As you can see on the left side, you've got the handheld shots, and it doesn't make a massive amount of difference having the IBIS turned on here because you are moving the camera around quite a lot, which is not going to look good unless you're going for that kind of documentary look. Moving more into just looking at the gimbal shots, I can't personally notice a massive amount of difference here. It looks good on both sides. This might be this certain type of shot, this tracking shot. It doesn't really seem to make a difference for me. And as you can see, the gimbal gyro stabilization here, it does look nice and smooth, but so does the general gimbal shot with the IBIS. But really, I think for walking shots, you probably don't need to apply gyro stabilization if you're already using a gimbal, as I think it probably looks good enough. So moving on to the running test, we can immediately see that both the handheld shots look terrible. They look absolutely brutal, but I don't think many people would be shooting handheld if they're trying to get a tracking running shot, to be honest. So it was just to show you how bad that looks, really. But then focusing on the gimbal shots, I would say that there is definitely a more noticeable difference between the two shots now than there was with the walking shots. I think the gyro stabilization does do a good job of actually getting rid of those micro jitters in the footage, where these are still visible in the IBIS only footage to some extent. Finally, I wanted to see if we could stabilize the handheld footage to get something usable, and this is where things definitely get interesting. The initial footage is literally all over the place, but the stabilized footage actually looks pretty stable. To get this stabilization, you do have to put a pretty heavy crop on the footage, but it's pretty impressive what you can get out of it, to be honest. So we've seen what we can do with gyro stabilization in the A7C, and it's extremely impressive, but it doesn't come without caveats and other things to consider when using this feature. So the first thing is that the camera actually records gyro data for all footage you shoot, but that doesn't mean you'll get the same results with every bit of footage that you shoot. It all depends on the camera's settings. So to get cinematic footage or natural looking footage, I stand by the 180-degree shutter rule. And what this dictates is that you should shoot at 1/2 times the frame rate of your footage. So for example, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then you would go for ideally 1/48 of a second shutter speed. But most of these cameras actually shoot, the closest you can get is 1/50th. So that's kind of what I usually shoot, 1/50th of a second shutter speed to get natural looking footage that kind of mimics what the eye sees in terms of motion blur and things like that. So this is where catalystbrowse doesn't deal well with it. The motion blur actually messes up the stabilization and you get lots of artifacts in the footage, as I'll show on screen now. But this doesn't look good and it's not desirable. It's not what you want to see from the footage. It actually gets in the way of the footage and makes it worse, in my opinion. So I'd rather have shaky footage than having these artifacts coming into it. So for this stabilization method to be most effective, you actually need to shoot at a high shutter speed. And this really sacrifices that natural look and that motion blur that you'd want in your video to make it look natural and cinematic. So that's a downside, in my opinion. And linked to this, it means that for me, who's someone who likes to shoot using that 180-degree shutter rule, I have to actively and consciously think about shooting in a higher frame rate so that I can actually stabilize it in post with gyro stabilization. Otherwise, any footage that I have shot and I want to, recover because it's too shaky, I can't do it because I've shot it with motion blur, and that means that it'll just come out looking terrible at the end of the day. So I'd rather just have it shaky than actually stabilized with artifacts all over the screen. So for me, it's kind of a deal breaker of actually using this feature because you have to actually consciously think about it. I think it would be a really fantastic feature if you could use it to recover footage and fix footage, rather than actually actively shooting to be able to use this feature. And then thirdly, also linked to the high shutter speed, is it's going to be difficult to get footage that you can actually stabilize in post in low light situations because you have to shoot at such a high shutter speed. I think I tend to shoot about a minimum of 1/500 of a second, but it also depends on the subject that you're shooting, how fast you're moving, etc. If you're still getting motion blur at that shutter speed, then you'd have to probably put it up even higher. So it depends what you're shooting, but it's going to really severely limit your low light performance because you have to shoot a really fast aperture. You'd also have to shoot with a really high ISO to counter that. So it would probably end up actually making your footage look worse. So bear that in mind as well. And finally, a really important thing to consider here is that you do actually have to render this footage through catalystbrowse. So if you were shooting an entire video with the intention of actually stabilizing the whole video, depending on how long your video is, this could take a long time because you have to first put everything into catalystbrowse, stabilize it, select the crop, which will probably be different for each shot depending on how shaky it is, and then you would have to render all that footage out, then put it into your editing software, and then you can start editing the video. So it adds a whole layer of extra work on top of everything else. So these are a lot of things that are actually downsides to consider, and they are quite major downsides in my opinion. So fundamentally, I think gyro stabilization with catalystbrowse is a great additional feature to the Sony A7C, and I think the key word there is additional. It's not an essential everyday use kind of feature, and the reason behind that is the things I just outlined really. And because you're shooting at high shutter speed, it sacrifices that natural look, and I don't think a lot of videographers would probably want to do that, which is why it's a nice additional feature. It's nice to have, but it's not something I personally will find myself using a lot. I've only really been using it for videos like this where I'm testing it out and seeing what we can do with it and what the limits are and things like that. So hopefully this has helped you out, but let me know what your opinion is down below. What do you think of this feature? Would you use it all the time? Do you use it all the time? I'm really interested to find out, so let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to support the channel, then please hit that like button. It really helps me out. And we talk about tech on this channel. We talk about cameras specifically and gear and some other things as well. So if that sounds good to you, then please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell down below to keep up to date with all the latest content and videos as they come out. And to join a small but growing community here on this channel, I'd love to have you as part of that. But as usual, it's been a pleasure, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Cheers.